Hello. Where are we? Let's see. Thank you very much for, I would say for inviting me to talk at this conference, but actually I emailed Matt and said, can I come and talk at this conference? And he said yes. So thank you, Matt. And it's wonderful to just be here on the event of the centennial as well. It's a fantastic opportunity. So I'm here to discuss a map I made about Grand Canyon. You've probably been looking at it over the last day or so. It's this really charming, delightful, happy map about everybody that's died in the every known death, I should say, that's occurred in Grand Canyon. These two kind of crazy-looking maps that have been on the wall over here. So this is a talk about that map and my relationship with that map, some of the trials, tribulations of making it, some of the issues that have arisen as a function of making it. So in 2012, I made this map. I'd recently arrived at Esri. I started at Esri in 2011, and I came to Esri to help share our workflows, help people learn how to make better maps using the Esri software. And of course, you're after good content, and you're after useful information that people can sort of gravitate to and be interested in. You know, getting eyes on a map is a really important characteristic, making that map speak to people in a way that attracts them in. So in 2012, I made this map of all known deaths in Grand Canyon. And actually it's two maps. It's a print map and it's also a web map, both of which required very different approaches to the cartographic aspect that I wanted to work with. So it's a story about this map, or these maps, inspired by another story. But how did I ever get to the point of being fascinated with such a macabre subject for a map? Well, like many people interested in maps, you can point to your childhood, and you can all normally find an exact moment when things began to fall into place. My father was an academic geologist back in the East Midlands in the middle of the UK. My home was often filled with abstract geologic maps of who knows where, because it's all made up, right? And my father was good at making up geology maps. In fact, he made up the geology of southern Norway, if you're interested. So I pored over the maps, and we also had a subscription to National Geographic, and I always loved it when it would come through the door with a little red label on the spine. It meant it had a map. So you tip it open, and the map falls out, and you spend some time with the map. So July 1978, the spine simply said Grand Canyon, and I opened up the map as a 9-year-old boy in the middle of England, and that was what I saw. We've heard a lot about this fantastic map, but perhaps more than any, this is the one that led me into a career in geography, which I enjoyed at school, and eventually cartography, which I enjoyed at university, and fell into a career in it. I didn't know who Bradford and Barbara Washburn was as a 9-year-old boy in England. I didn't care. I was looking at that, and that was the inspiration. That was a map that inspired me. I didn't even know it was a masterpiece then. I now believe it is. It's one of the best maps I think that has ever been made. The colours, the shades, the textures, it felt more like a painting to me, even though I was looking at an extremely accurate map. And of course, what did it evoke? It evoked feelings of, I've got to go to that place sometime. And does it look like that? Is this a reality? So on some level, I also knew that becoming a geographer and making maps like this was something that I wanted to do. So fast forward, I had to wait another 25 years before I got an opportunity to visit in the summer of 2003. And that's me with my better half, Linda, at the top, Mather Campground. And if you could turn round, she's watching now. Hi. I'll be home later. So we were on a month-long road trip from San Fran all the way through some of the country's most fantastic scenery and iconic locations, and we stumped up at the campground. It turns out that Grand Canyon did look a little bit like that map. When you sort of first see you get past all of the stuff at the village and you see the sort of overlooks. It's stunning. And I also got to go again last year with my brother and his family and do the old helicopter bit in and out of the canyon, and that was fantastic. So what did I use? What map did I use when I got there? Well, we heard about this yesterday. Who knew I'd actually get to meet Tom Patterson, let alone count him as a friend? But in 2003, when I turned up at the gate and was handed one of Tom's fantastic maps, again, I didn't know who had done it, but it was a map that obviously guided me around the canyon. So Linda and I were struck by the majesty. We were just two Brits camping, surrounded by deadly animals, because we don't have deadly animals in the UK. And it gets very dark at night in the campground, and we were halfway through the trip and we'd run out of reading material. So I went to the visit centre and looked for something to read in the camp at night to one another. And I was immediately drawn to this book. I don't know why. But this is a book, Michael Ghiglieri and Thomas Myers' Over the Edge: Death in Grand Canyon, that had been published in 2001, and it was great because you could just flick through and see all these fascinating, often heart-rending stories, sometimes humorous stories, how people actually got themselves into so much trouble. And I really enjoyed the book, but if you've read the book, there's not a lot of maps in there. There's general location maps, and I wanted to know where these events had taken place. Okay, so that's that's the book. Perhaps a little gory, certainly macabre, but filled with lots of amazing stories. And as a side note, it was brought in sharp focus to us when we were on one of the buses that go around the rim, and a lady was getting off at the front of the bus. I think it was at the Bright Angel Trailhead. And the driver said, "Excuse me, where are you going? What are your plans?" And she said, "I think I'm going to hike down into the canyon, and then I'm going to get a mule ride back." And he looked at her, as did the rest of the bus. She was dressed in a short skirt, a pink bikini top, flip-flops on her feet with a small bottle of water. And the driver said, "You will die." And she didn't go down. And I've checked since, she's not in the book, so... So the driver does more than just drive. But it's in stark contrast. We go there as tourists, but it's an extremely hostile environment, and you can get into a lot of trouble. So fast forward again, in 2011, after 20 years of working in cartography in the UK, I left academia. I went to Esri, and this map was rolled up in the corner of one of my co-workers' offices. It was done by Scott Carter of USGS, a map made in 3D. Now, remember, my role at Esri now is to help develop workflows and teach people how to make maps, often kind of crazy maps. So I had this idea to reinvent this map. But the map had already been created. I didn't just want to remake that map. I wanted to do something with it. So I had this idea of mapping where deaths had occurred on top of this map in all its gory 3D-ness. So I got in touch with Michael, asked his permission to use the book as a source, and spent some considerable time locating all of these deaths. There were about 770, 450 separate incidents. He'd mapped them according to a name, a mile down Bright Angel Trail, or a particular point of the river mile roughly. So that's what the source data was. But if you're working in a GIS, you need lat longs, so I had to create that data itself. He also, as it turned out, sent me a PDF of a 2012 update of the book just before publication. So I was very grateful for that. It meant that the map was going to be updated to the point at which it was going to be published. So what about the 3D? Well, we heard a little bit yesterday about anaglyphs. We're probably very familiar with these horrible looking images where you have a blue and a red, slightly offset image, and the glasses you wear filter out the blue and the red light, send a different image to each eye, and you get this false stereo perspective. But the USGS map used a different technique called chromastereoscopy. All right, after me, chromastereoscopy. There you go. It's not easy to say. But it's a technique where you don't offset the images. What you do is you encode depth using colour. On the left there is an anaglyph version. I think this is Mount St Helens, and on the right is a chroma stereoscopic version. Red is encoded as closer to your eyes. Blue is encoded furthest away, and all of the colours of the rainbow fit in between. It's not a colour scheme I would recommend for 99.9% of maps, but it's pretty good if you want to make a chromastereoscopic map. The better way of describing this is, I'm sure some of you know this is the greatest ever album created, but it's a very simple principle. White light hits a prism, and the different components of the electromagnetic spectrum are refracted in different ways, and red is refracted closer and blue is refracted further away. That's that. So all you need is the glasses, right? Now you can tell how long ago I made this map. I still had hair. And so I've put a few of these glasses out for you. You've probably been looking at the map with them occasionally. And if you see one of these little glass symbols in the top right of the slides as I cycle through the remainder of the presentation, you should be able to put the glasses on and see some 3D-ishness. It doesn't work for everybody. There was a question this morning about how do you deal with colour deficiencies and different types of seeing. This is a map for the kind of 90% who have what we might call kind of normal colour vision. So this won't work for everybody, and I'm sorry about that, but there's no way of accommodating everybody's viewing types and styles. It's a map very much that depends on the ability to see that colour. So you can put the glasses on and you should be able to see that colour chart on the left. Reds should appear closer to you, and then progressively you go through to the dark blues that recede away. Okay, so the colour of any individual map element and its immediate surrounding determine where it sits in the visual hierarchy of the map. Cartographers often use visual hierarchy to bring things closer to the viewing point, to accentuate or emphasize certain things, and to make other things recede into the background. Here I'm kind of just, turning that up to 11 and using colour to really push that that contrast. All right, so I built a colour ramp in ArcMap. Who remembers ArcMap? Okay. That's probably the only time I mention ArcMap today. I'll go on to something else in a minute. But you build a colour ramp in ArcMap, an algorithmic colour ramp, and you set about creating the base map, which starts with a digital elevation model. And actually, a lot of the techniques that I'm employing are very similar to the way in which Tom Patterson was describing his workflow yesterday. The difference is I'm using Esri software. He was largely using Adobe. It's kind of two separate ways to get to a similar endpoint. And this is a typical hillshade with a northwest illuminated source at 135 degrees and 45 degree angle. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but that was my basic hillshade. I had elevation tints or hypsometric tints based on that new chromastereoscopic color ramp. Slightly muted because I didn't want really pure colors to be shouting and screaming at people and giving everyone a headache. But you can put those together, crunch them with a technique called pan-chromatic sharpening, and you end up with red plateaus, greens and browns down through the canyon, and down to what will eventually become another beautiful blue Colorado River. Does it work for you? Okay, good. Now, if you remember that Mount St Helens image a moment ago, it looked a bit bizarre. A mountain peak that's red, whereas usually you would see whites or purples or something else to connotate elevation. But I thought with the Grand Canyon, red plateaus and then descending through colour in the canyon actually wasn't too far of a stretch. It didn't seem too weird, even though clearly it's completely made up colouring. So I then, from the book, from Ghiglieri and Meyer's book, went through, plotted them on a map. I helped design these pictograms, which were trying to symbolize the character of the incident or the circumstances of the death. it's actually, as it turns out, pretty difficult to design symbols when you've got suicide and other pretty horrific events. But we thought we did a pretty good job, and I started putting these symbols on the map. The only difficulty was I was having to use a lot of leader lines, because it turns out a lot of people didn't venture far from the South Rim, which is a bit lazy if you're going to kill yourself, quite frankly. So when you've got this giant map, okay, you've got this beautiful environment, and you find out that actually most, apart from one or two, most deathly incidents occur in a very small space. You've got this classic cartographic problem of scale, content, big geography, small concentrated area, but that's just a problem to deal with. So I dealt with it here with a lot of leader lines, and I ended up with this map. Final map layout includes the addition of text, contextual detail, which was symbolized, and I was, by design, going for a comic book aesthetic. I was going for a very visceral sort of aesthetic where it's designed to get a response as a large poster. And so there are these speech bubbles with maybe half a dozen or so descriptions from the book of how certain circumstances evolved. But it's a fixed scale because it's a paper map, which meant the top left had to have the inset for the South Rim. And I always felt a little bit uncomfortable about this map because, of course, the really interesting area is in the top left. Maybe I should have switched it. Maybe the canyon should have gone in the top left and the South Rim should have been the main map. But then you don't get the majesty of that entire dragon. So that's the map, and we actually printed it and this is just about full size. This is Linda again. Hi. For scale. And we printed this as a gigantic map at one of our user conferences, and there's people with glasses, and it's a bit of a thrill when you see your work printed at that size, isn't it, Matt? It's a wonderful thing to see people actually go up to a map that big and start touching it. And you've got people when they're touching it and pointing and getting that reaction is wonderful. So obviously I wrote blogs and things to describe how people can make these things. Feedback. Generally, people liked the map. But, I will be totally honest. There was some criticism. And the criticism was of the type of, I think you've been a little bit too graphic. Perhaps not quite as respectful as you could have been. One person said, all that red, it looks a little bit like blood splattered all over the map. And when you're dealing with the subject of death, maybe I hadn't been as sensitive as I perhaps could have been. So, you take on board some of this, and you think about your work. It got a lot of decent press. It actually won an International Cartographic Association award for the best map for one year. It was highlighted in another book where actually one of my friend and colleagues, Alex Kenneth, said, an immersion into a sensory experience that is perhaps reminiscent of film director Quentin Tarantino's work. All right, okay. And even last year it turned up on Slovenian national TV, where one of my colleagues in cartography, Dusan Petrovic, was there talking about maps that have kind of piqued people's attention in the past few years. And the print map itself has been downloaded 1,500 times. So what about a web version? Well, you can't put all those points on a map because and here's a pun, you get death by pushpin. The classic one dot for every incident. So I wanted to employ a technique called binning, which aggregates data that is closely located at smaller scales. So you end up creating a set of bins, and I used hexagons because hexagons the best shape ever. And you can see now that in certain parts of the South Rim in particular, 20 deaths, 4 deaths, whatever. I turned the pictogram symbols into hexagons to align. Turns out that triangles don't tessellate. Well, they do tessellate, but you have to have upside down triangles if you're going to go that way. So hexagons became the shape of choice. And then if we're creating a single map, okay, you have one scale and you have to make certain decisions. and the map becomes the map. For a web map, you're in a multi-scale environment, so you basically have to make as many different maps for each scale, so that at each scale it works, and that the transition between scales also works. So don't let anybody tell you web maps are simple, okay? They're pretty simple to make, but to make them work at multiple scales is a little bit of a task. And I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but you can just see by how that grid is completed that there are lots of different decisions about content and visibility at different scales. And it ended up looking a little bit like that. It was fairly clunky, but that was only because our web technology was fairly rudimentary in the very early stages back in 2012. And this is the first iteration of the web map, and as you zoom in, you go from those hexagons down into the individual symbols. I never liked this map. The benefit of the web map meant that you can click on each of these icons and actually get the details of what happened, who died, what were the circumstances, what was the source material, whether it was a newspaper report or a National Park Service incident report, and so on. You can't do that with a print map. So there are obviously very good reasons why you might want your information as a web map and not a print map. I never liked it though. Although I checked, it had been viewed about 120,000 times up until a few weeks ago, which isn't quite 3.5 million of Tom's maps, but I'll take it. So I've always wanted to update them. You need two things. You need a reason to update, and you need new data. Because any map like this, sadly, the data is out of date almost as soon as the map is out. I just needed an excuse. And the excuse came in the rather bizarre fashion of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So he turned 50 last year, and he was going to bungee jump out of a helicopter over the canyon to celebrate. And I just turned 50, and I went out for a nice meal. So that probably it probably explains a lot. Anyway, the production company got in touch. They'd seen the map. They wanted to use it. They wanted my map on, and I was a little concerned. Is Will Smith going to end up on my map? But anyway, you know, the possibility of having your work alongside Will Smith in one of his productions, I thought, yeah, let's do it. Why not? So off I went, and so that's Will, bungee jumping. He survived. The National Park Service search and rescue guys are very helpful. They gave me updated information to the end of last year. And I set about creating the map, but I wanted to improve the hillshade. Remember, that's the old hillshade. There's lots of problems with it. And I'm just going to flick to the new one. There's actually 60 different hillshades going on in there, all smooshed together to create something that maybe shows the bedding a little bit better, the steepness of some of the cliff edges and so on. And then I updated the colours and turned it into that. So I saturated my chromastereoscopic elevation tints even more to push it up a little bit so that it perhaps helps the 3D experience. And remember that original Grand Canyon map, Tibor Toth, used a lot of saturated stuff, and actually the hill shading did a similar sort of job, very dramatic. And so I went from this map to this map, the new map. There's been about 100 new deathly incidents since the 2012 version, which this map incorporates. Does it work in 3D? All right, let's take a little vote. Do you prefer the new one, hands up, or the old one? So new one, old one. Ta-da! Okay, so improving on your work is a great, cartographic tenet. So there's less red, it's less dramatic, it's perhaps less visceral, but perhaps has a more long-term usability. There's now a satellite image behind it, so it's not completely red. There's a kind of a focused area. I decided not to encode elevation into the symbols, so it keeps it cleaner and more simple. There's still an inset, but I've managed not to have any leader lines on this map, which was a challenge, but that's what cartography is about, to make a challenge. Paul, he's already shown me 5 minutes. Now you show me 5 minutes. I'm going with you. So I downplayed the 3D characteristic, I downplayed that comic book aesthetic, got it back to something that perhaps is a little more standard but still has that 3D-ness. It's perhaps more harmonious, less shouty. I would still contend that if you went to a map gallery, that red map, the really red one, would draw you in first, but you would probably go to that one on the right more often. Okay? You probably wouldn't go back to the harsh, bright red much. And then the web, because of time, I'm not going to go out to the live map. I'm going to just show you a few stills. The web map version is very similar to the print version, but you can click on the hexagons and get information about the summary of everything that happened at that particular point. Technically, if you come to the Esri User Conference next July, I'll tell you how this is made differently to the previous one. There's a lot of different stuff, but in a very, very quick way, ArcMap was a pain in the proverbial to get this onto the web. Now we use ArcGIS Pro, and it's literally right-click, publish, and there it is. So a lot has happened technologically in the last 6 or 7 years that has made this map far more easily published to the web. If only that happened several years ago, I might still have a bit more hair, but you know, that's life. So, the other thing that I've been doing, just to kind of finish up over the last year or so, is write a book. And remember, I started this story with a book. We went to the bookshop and bought a book, and it became a map. And I've written a book that I've now been able to put my work into. It's kind of turning it around. But that's a little bit arrogant, putting your own work in a book. So I've also put what I still consider to be one of the world's best maps in the book, and with a lovely commentary by the current Director of Cartography at National Geographic, Martin Gamache, who expresses his view of this map as the work that went into this map set the bar for what cartographic excellence was. It still does. And, you know, someone like me, from a 9-year-old to 50, making maps, I still can't make a map as good as this. But that's the beauty of mapping. You can still keep trying. So, whatever happened to my map being used in the Will Smith bungee jump film? It didn't. It ended up on the cutting room floor. But to my mind, that's a lot better than Will ending up on the canyon floor and me having to put him on the map. So I've got one final slide, but before I get to that, I put these glasses out, and on one of them I left my business card, and it said, written on the card, "Do not discard." So who found that? I'm going to come back to you in about 30 seconds, sir. So the final slide, thank you very much for listening. I'm contractually obliged to put that up there. But those two URLs at the top, the first one takes you to the web map of this newly updated map. The second one takes you to a PDF, which you can download to your leisure and print out if you so wish. So they're both free. You can take them and use them. You can buy the book if you like. It's actually quite good. This gentleman down here gets a free copy. So, okay. So that's it. That's my Friday afternoon. Thank you very much.
That was an amazing present.
It was quite good, is what you're saying.
That was so good it broke the speaker, or it broke the microphone. So we have time for a couple questions for Dr. Field. Anybody?
So just to nitpick a little, as I'm sure you know, Will Smith jumped into the Little Colorado, right?
Yeah.
He was outside the boundary. So that leads me, where do you draw the boundaries for your map? I mean, since some of these deaths are happening in the Colorado drainage, but outside the boundaries of the park.
I think they're all within the national park boundary, if I'm right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and check.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I know that Park Service didn't allow him to do things like that, or, the other people tried to jump.
Yeah, no, in fact, the map I showed earlier is, I didn't put the boundary on, but yeah, his little bungee thing came down
Thanks.
Little Colorado.
We'll come back that way next.
Several years ago, I read or actually skim-read a book in Hayden Library, and at that time there were two California students, college students, who had a wild several weeks by going down the Colorado. And at that time, because no one knew where they were rumored to be dead in the Colorado. It turned out later on they hiked up the south rim, and when they found them, the park people wouldn't let them go back and continue the trip, but with some fast talking, they were able to continue the trip. I'm just wondering, have you run into that particular story? Because I don't even remember the title of it, but they wrote a pretty sizable book about that, and I'm wondering if you have very many near misses where people have been reported, and I think that was reported in papers all over the country. Have you run into that
All right.
too?
So the short answer is no, but I'll give you the reason. Like many cartographers who are interested in mapping data, we don't care about the subject matter too much. It's just data. It's a map, okay? So, I take my source. I trust my source. I report my source. The Park Service SAR guys have given me the updated data. I trust that as a source. But my role in this is to make a map of that data. Going out and doing another year or two's worth of research to fill in the gaps, and that's for the Washburns of this world, I make this map in a week or so, and I move on to another map, and that's part of what I do. So, yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if this topic is pretty macabre, pretty grim. I was wondering, though, if this was the first time that you've really mapped out something like this, a similar topic, and if in the future you want to look into other, very complex topics.
So I have a website at work called carto.maps.arcgis.com, and if you go there, there's actually a really frightening pattern. It turns out I end up mapping a lot of deathly stuff. And I'm not going to show you now, but yeah, I have to get away from some of this at times because, a lot of times data is it's off past events, and clearly dead people are past events, so it becomes a good data source. So I end up doing that quite a bit, but wherever possible, maps of soccer, maps of football for me, maps of Irish surnames, you name it. It's just good data that creates a good thematic map is the key.
Hi. Did you think about doing any heat maps or anything for types of death?
So the types of death are broadly encoded in those symbols. Okay. You could perhaps make slightly more symbols because, river is river traveller. It's crossing the river. It's drowned while swimming. There's lots of different subcategories. But I felt maybe 9 or 10 symbols did a good enough job. Fall is another one. Is it fall in the canyon, on the rim, crossing a road? What is it? So you have to make those decisions about generalizing your data and your categories to a point which you think works for that map. Heat maps, that's a great one. And this has been live streamed, so I'll be careful what I say, but I hate heat maps. Largely because they form this amorphous blob of something. Okay, each of those points is a point. I can see where something happened. If I aggregate into this sort of blob that shades out with transparent edges to some unknown area. I mean, the classic one is you take any maps where you're maybe mapping something that occurs on land. Let's say the entire west coast of the USA. Something occurs on land. You create a heat map. That symbol goes off into the Pacific Ocean, but clearly the events can't happen there. So you have to be very careful when you're making heat maps that you work within the bounds of logic, because people are going to believe what they see, not necessarily know the processes that you've gone through as a cartographer to get there, and therefore be able to reflect on that as part of their seeing. If that sort of answers it. No was the answer.
So I don't have a question, I have a comment. I was thinking maybe for your next map, considering that you liked Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, perhaps you could do a depth map of lunar rovers on the dark side of the moon in 3D.
Okay.
Just remember me when you publish that map. All right, let's give
I've
Dr.
done Mars, if that helps. No, I put David Bowie on the map. What more do you want?
Fair enough. All right, let's give Dr. Field a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.